Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to another Discovery Live Ask an Expert. For those of you who have tuned in before, I am a new face tonight. My name is Sierra Tamkin. I'm the Learning Experiences Manager at Fort Collins Museum of Discovery, and I am so excited to be your guest moderator for this evening. We have some really great speakers lined up for our panel tonight, and I'll bring them on in just a moment and we'll get started. Discovery Live Ask an Expert is an ongoing series of programming that we're doing here at the museum. For the remainder of the year, all of our Discovery Live programs will be focused around different topics related to mental health, and these are in conjunction with the museum's new special exhibition, Mental Health Mind Matters. I hope you all have a chance to stop by the museum and see this new exhibition. It is all about destigmatizing the conversation and making it okay to talk about mental health. It's on display through January 10th, so if you can, please stop by and visit us and check it out. Lastly, before we go ahead and bring on our panelists, I want to thank you all for tuning in tonight and let you know that if you do enjoy our program and would like to help us continue bringing this type of programming to the community, you can make a donation to the museum. The work we do is only possible with support from our community and folks like you. So you can visit FCMoD.org/donate. All right, we're gonna go ahead and bring on our panelists for this evening. Tonight, we are chatting with Scott Smith from the Alliance for Suicide Prevention and Kimberly Pratt from North Range Behavioral Health. And we are gonna talk about their recent work in suicide prevention here in Northern Colorado. Scott, Kimberly, hello, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you both for being on with us this evening. We're really glad to have you here. And if you don't mind, just giving a brief introduction for us about who you are and what you do and the different organizations you work with.
Cool, I'll go first. My name's Kimberly Pratt. My pronouns are she, her. And I work with North Range Behavioral Health. I am the project coordinator for a program called Suicide Education and Support Services. And our program offers suicide prevention trainings to the communities in Weld County primarily at no cost. We also offer support for families who have lost a loved one to suicide. I have been at this position for about 8 years, and in that time, I've trained about 45,000 community members in suicide prevention efforts. We've done crisis response to 35 different schools and businesses across the county. And I'm also a trainer of trainers. And so I train our mental health experts to be trainers of suicide prevention programs. And we do that across the state. I wear lots of hats. So I also work with the Office of Suicide Prevention at the state of Colorado as the regional youth coordinator, and really just do a lot of work related to suicide prevention for our community, and work with Scott really, really frequently. So I'm really excited to be invited to participate in this.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks, Kimberly. So glad you could join us. Yeah, my name is Scott Smith. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the executive director here at the Alliance for Suicide Prevention of Larimer County. I've been in this position for a little over a year and a half, and we prevent suicide in Larimer County through training and education, providing outreach and offering support. So essentially we have 4 different areas of programming, one of which is youth education. So we're in most middle schools and high schools across Larimer County. We also do adult education, which is free. Everything we do is actually free. So we offer free training in suicide prevention to any group, club, business. And then we also do peer and targeted outreach. So we know some of the highest risk populations for suicide, which are adult age men, veterans, and LGBTQ plus youth. So we have a dedicated peer outreach coordinator for each one of those populations. And then we also do some grief support services. So we have a couple different grief support groups for people who've lost a loved one to suicide going on in the community. And in addition to those areas of programming, we also work closely with the Office of Suicide Prevention at the state level, and we're involved with something called the Colorado National Collaborative. So we're one of 6 counties across the state that were chosen to provide a upstream comprehensive suicide prevention framework with the goal of reducing suicides by 20% by the year 2024. So that's about as quick of a little introduction as I could give about what we do.
That's fantastic. Thank you. You both are doing a lot.
You're telling me.
Yeah, we try.
Yeah. Well, all of that work sounds really amazing, and I'm so excited to have you both here to chat about everything you're doing, and hopefully get some questions for our audience members. So when we talk about suicide prevention and services that we can provide and programs that we can provide as a part of that prevention, what are we talking about? What is the work, the day-to-day work that's happening there?
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, well, it's a great question because there's a whole spectrum of things, right? And so if we look way on the one hand of really upstream things, prevention of suicide looks a lot like the prevention of all sorts of other negative health outcomes, right? So like kind of lack of connection or lack of belonging is often referred to as a risk factor for suicide. But it's also a risk factor for substance use. It's also a risk factor for being homeless. It's a risk factor for all sorts of things. So on the one hand, we have way upstream things that we do that can be just as vague as trying to increase community connection. So offer opportunities for community members to connect with one another and feel a greater sense of belonging. So that's kind of on one end of the spectrum. A little bit further down, we kind of have some like education and prevention programs. These are most commonly referred to as gatekeeper trainings. I'll let Kimberly speak a little bit more to that, but that's a big piece of it. But then further down the spectrum, we also have some more direct interventions. So just connecting folks to resources. So Larimer County is actually pretty resource rich. I think the problem is just making sure individuals can connect to those resources. So we also serve as kind of a bridge of connecting folks to resources. So that's also a really important role. And then further down the acuity line in that spectrum, you have individual therapy, crisis services, if folks are in immediate danger of trying to take their own lives. And then we have like inpatient hospitalization. So there's really a whole spectrum of which we operate in.
Yeah, I would only add to that, just to talk more about the gatekeeper trainings. When people are thinking about like, what is it that I can do personally? Like, how can I prevent suicide? Often they're looking for like, I need a training, I need more information. And obviously, in addition to all that upstream stuff that Scott was talking about, probably the most popular thing and one of the most helpful tools that people can do is engage in these gatekeeper trainings, which are offered all over Colorado. We have dozens and dozens of trainers in Northern Colorado training thousands of people every year in a program called Question, Persuade, Refer, which is primarily for adults who are learning to support themselves, their friends, their family, and also younger people. I love this training so much. I can't talk about it enough. So many people get CPR certified. It's something that kids do. It's something that adults do. And QPR is a 60 to 90 minute training that holds the same weight. It's nationally recognized. It's something you can put on a resume. It's the same thing as a CPR certification, except for it's mental health and suicide prevention. And again, that's offered at no cost to the community. And if we can get in touch with anybody, and we'd be happy to offer that training to people. And so it's a really great way for people to engage in suicide prevention. And we'll do it for one person. We'll do it for 100 people. We'll, as many people, or if one person sees this site and goes, I want that training, we're going to do that training, because for us, that could save one life. And that's all, that's one life is one life. So.
Thank you. That's really fantastic to have that sort of training to offer here in the community. And I think there are some coming up actually scheduled at the library. I'm looking at you, Scott, because I think the Alliance is involved.
Yeah, we have a lot kind of up in the air right now. But yeah, I think in the next 3 weeks, we have at least 6 different trainings offered. And like Kimberly said, like there's so many different great trainers in this community and just in the community of Northern Colorado in general. So I think it's just a great resource for folks to access. And I personally it doesn't matter to me if we're the trainers or if someone else is. I just want the most amount of people to be trained as possible. So there's all sorts of opportunities You can find information about it on our website, community forums, but I think QPR and just gatekeeper training in general is a great first step. It would really have a huge impact if we got more community members trained. I mean, Kimberly used the analogy of CPR, which I think is the perfect analogy for it. So if we were like downtown Fort Collins and Old Town walking around, if unfortunately someone like passed out or fell down, chances are there would be an individual that'd be CPR certified who could go and provide help temporarily for that person until a medical professional arrived. And it's kind of the same concept with QPR. So I think if we really increase the amount of people in our community that were QPR trained, if they notice someone that was struggling with their mental health or was exhibiting some warning signs related to suicide, they could kind of provide some temporary assistance and then connect that person with some mental health professionals and get them squared away. So I think it's just a really great step that communities can do that really have an impact on people's lives.
I would just add, I'm sorry, I feel like I could talk about this for hours,
Yeah.
But I would just add, I feel, at least in my personal experience, we are so much more likely to have somebody in our own personal life who exhibits a mental health crisis or goes through a really tough time or has a thought of suicide than we ever are to know somebody in our own personal life who's going to need CPR. And it's just such a valuable training that we're excited to offer the community.
That's a really good point. I mean, I've been CPR certified for, 12 or 15 years, and thankfully I've never had to use it. And I've had to, address people that were experiencing suicidality just in my day-to-day life, at least 5, maybe 6, 7 times, not professionally, but just from friends, neighbors, relatives. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, thank you both. That is a really, really interesting perspective, Kimberly. And I'm so glad you brought that up because I think so often mental health touches our lives in a lot of different ways. And it is really interesting to think about the trainings like that are so helpful and would be so amazing and useful for many of us. We're not always aware of those. And, a huge part of what is going on with the exhibit at the museum and what we really want to do is help get that conversation going. So that more people are aware that these opportunities are out there and that it does affect us. Let's talk about it and let's get the help and the resources we can, so that's really fantastic. I'm curious to hear from both of you what some recent trends are in suicide prevention and the field and also how you've seen it change because, in my own research and reading up, it seems like it's a relatively new field. And so I'm curious what's changing, what's happening now, what are you seeing as far as new developments in prevention?
Yeah. So one of the things I think that has changed the most since I've come in, so I've been in this field for about 8 years now, and when I first came in, one of the things that people talked about a lot was that people who died from suicide, about 90% of them had a diagnosable mental health disorder. And just 2 years ago in 2018, the CDC came out and said, actually, that is not true anymore. It's more like 50%. And what we have found that has been really fascinating and interesting and really helpful and important for us to learn is that so much of it, and I'm going to say this wrong and I'll fact check it and I'll provide you with the right information so you can share it with the community. There is this gentleman, I went to a conference about 2 years ago, and he talked about environmental mismatch and just us not fitting into our environment and us feeling isolated. And they did one of the big hospitals. Again, this is not great that I don't have these. I think it was Kaiser. I will fact check myself for all of you guys. But they did this study on isolation and loneliness. And what they found is that so many people were feeling so disconnected and so lonely. And one of the big pillars when we're talking about suicide and suicide death is that this idea of intense loneliness and not feeling connected and needing people in our corner. One of the top protective factors that somebody can have in their life, whether they're a teenager or an adult, is to have a trusted person. For teenagers, it's really important that that trusted person is an adult. For an adult, obviously, it's another adult. But we're pack animals. We survive we need people in our corner. And so when we lose those people, it significantly impacts us. When we don't feel connected to our communities, when we don't feel connected to each other, to our families, to our friends, it has a real big impact on us. And the trend in suicide prevention, or one of them right now, is identifying like, what is the environmental mismatch? What is that connectedness that we have lost as people? As we get more connected, right, in theory, through all of the technologies that we have, why are we also more disconnected than we ever have been? And so that's a really interesting trend that we are starting to see. We're also talking a lot about means restriction. And I know Scott is really passionate about this. And so I want to make sure that he gets a chance to talk about that too. But I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add to that other thing, Scott, or to the topic I just talked about.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, that statistic was thrown around so much that's like over 90% of people that die by suicide have a diagnosed mental illness. And no doubt lots of folks do, and it is around half with kind of the newer research. But I think why that statistic was problematic is that it really otherized the problem of mental illness and otherized the problem of suicide. So if suicide's only occurring amongst people that have a mental illness, it kind of makes it their problem as opposed to like society's problem and all of our problem. And the reality is that it is all of our problem. And now some of the research that's been coming out in the last like 10 years, it really shows that, like Kimberly was saying, it's a lot of it is about environmental factors and environmental risk factors. So like lack of connection, lack of belonging are two of the biggest risk factors. And that's kind of a vague, difficult thing to improve on the individual level, but it's definitely something we can work on the community level, as a state, as a country. So it's just some of those more kind of broad upstream things. And increasing community connectedness also helps with a bunch of other negative outcomes in people's lives. So I think that's kind of a trend that I'm seeing, is folks moving to more of this kind of public health approach, where it's this comprehensive upstream increasing protective factors in communities to help with all sorts of other things, which has been great because we can align our efforts with folks that are working on substance misuse prevention or substance use prevention, with all sorts of other things. So it's really great to see a bunch of collaboration happen around this, because it's a lot easier to create some of these broader level community changes if you have a bunch of teams working together across the community. So that's been really nice. So I would agree with you, Kim. That's definitely one of the trends that we've been noticing as well. And I think just taking those kind of broader upstream strokes is a much more effective way. One example that I often use is economic instability is one of the biggest risk factors for suicide. So increasing the minimum wage by $1 an hour reduces the suicide rate from 4 to 6%. So it's a pretty small change monetarily, and it has a big, broad impact. So there's some legislative issues as well that greatly affect the suicide rate.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to point out, because I get this question a lot. When we're talking about upstream, we're talking about stuff that happens before somebody is in crisis. So things that we can do before somebody ever starts to have thoughts of suicide. I just wanted to clarify that for people, just in case.
Yeah, that's a perfect clarification. I'm always like, we live and breathe all this language, so I'm always jumping in and throwing out terms. I appreciate that. What's the saying? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of, or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you both.
I would, one of the other trends that we're seeing is safety, and talking about means and harm reduction, and what does that look like. And I think that it'd be great to hear Scott talk about that, because he's really good at it.
I could take up the next hour about it. Thanks for bringing that up, because means restriction is really becoming such a more a better understood piece when it comes to suicide prevention, and it's really an integral piece. So it's kind of been discussed for a while with some popular research. Thomas Joyner, who is kind of one of the most foremost scholars around suicide prevention work, talks a little bit about it. He refers to it as acquired ability to inflict lethal self-harm so it's kind of jargony and scholarly. But really, it's bringing up the piece that there's all these outside resources and kind of internal risk factors and outside risk factors. But really, for someone to actually die by suicide, there has to be this kind of ability and access to means. And I recently just finished Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. I mean, he highlighted this in that book. It's a great book. But the theory's been around for a little bit longer than that as well, that suicide's really a coupled phenomenon. So suicidal thoughts are always coupled with a very specific plan and a very specific means. So if you really want to be effective as individuals, as friends, neighbors, or as clinicians, the most effective way to prevent suicide, if someone is in crisis, is kind of by putting some either physical distance or some time and space distance in between someone and their plan or the means that they've chosen as their plan. So there's been a couple examples historically that have been used to prove this. So the Golden Gate Bridge, unfortunately, has been a place where a lot of people choose to end their lives and die by suicide. I think it was founded in 1937, 36, 37, something like that. But between then and the 1970s, there was a doctor, a social scientist, Richard Snyden, who interviewed 515 individuals who went to the Golden Gate Bridge during that time to jump off and take their own lives, but they were stopped by a citizen, or stopped by someone or a police officer. So they were physically restrained from jumping off the bridge. Out of those 515 individuals, only 25 went on to die by suicide using a different method. So everyone's plan is really specifically linked to an exact specific means. So if we can kind of disrupt that and just cause some time or space between that, we can have a real impact on it. And it's not that much different from, say, if you're at a party, one of your friends is too intoxicated, they drove there, you don't want to take their keys away from them, right? And call them a taxi or get them a safe ride home. So it's about that kind of temporary restriction around those lethal means. And then once they're sober, you can give them their keys back, give them out of their car the next morning, and it's not a problem. So it's really just kind of this harm reduction model. And I can go more into depth in that later on too, if we need to. But I think that's a really exciting piece that is really coming up, as the importance of kind of disrupting that exact plan around lethal means.
That is so fascinating. And I think that's often such a question for folks, is what can I do?
Yeah.
And at what point is it too late? And at what point can I still intervene? And so it's really interesting to hear about that.
I think maybe one final trend, and this kind of ties into the other stuff that we have been talking about, and ties to that question of what can I do, which we also have been talking about. You know, so often we hear about young people who die from suicide, and it's the second highest, or it's the second leading cause of death for young people nationwide. It's the leading cause of death in the state of Colorado. And it's really important, you know, this goes to that public health approach that we're always talking about, a 2-generation approach. So often people will approach us and say, can you go train the teenagers, give the teenagers resources? And the answer is, of course, always yes, always. We're going to do that for them. And we do that all over Colorado, in Larimer and Weld. And I'm always encouraging people that we can train the teenagers, but we also need to train the parents. We need to train, because we're training teenagers to seek out help. And usually that help comes from their parents or their trusted adults, right? And we need our adults to be prepared to receive that information. We need them to know what to do and where to go and to receive that. And so it's this 2-generation approach. It takes a village approach. It's the community public health approach to suicide prevention.
Well, and that feeds right back into this. It sounds to me like you guys are talking about this really holistic, very human approach to this. And you know, if we can ensure that people's lives are in the right place, and that they're getting what they need emotionally, physically, mentally, then the risk of suicide, it goes down by a lot. And so, you know, I think that's a, a really fascinating approach, that whole person. And Scott, I feel like that goes back to what you were saying too about like community collaboration and making sure that we have a healthy community. Healthy communities lead to healthy people, right? So, I think it sounds like there are really a lot of different places that this work can happen and a lot of different places to start from, to really bring this health and mental wellness to folks.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. We do have an audience question. So one of our viewers wants to know, how big of a problem is suicide in Larimer County?
Yeah. So, we'll kind of zoom out too. So we'll kind of start with Colorado. So Colorado's consistently in the 10 highest states with the highest suicide rate nationally. We've kind of been in there or hovering around there for quite some time. And then Larimer County within Colorado is also in that 10. So Larimer County is around 8th or 9th highest suicide rate out of all the counties in Colorado. So it's definitely a problem. It's definitely something that we need to address. And that doesn't mean that it's an epidemic or it's out of control or there's nothing we can do, because there's actually some tangible steps that we can do to reduce and prevent suicide. So I think, for the past couple of years, unfortunately, Larimer County has received in the kind of upper 70s or lower 80s amount of people who have died by suicide. And again, like I mentioned, that doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can do. And I think oftentimes we kind of get wrapped up in some of the numbers and how many people have died, which is important to be aware of that, because these are people's lives and it touches a lot of other community members. And just because that many people died by suicide, we don't often focus on the numbers of people that actually got help. So yes, there was, 81 people, unfortunately, that died by suicide last year. There's also tens of thousands of people in this community that were thinking about suicide, had a suicide attempt, was about to attempt suicide, and then they got the life-saving help and care that they needed, and now they're productive, happy members of society. Or they're still working on that, and they're in recovery, and that is so great. So I think, yes, it's a bit of a problem, and there's also a lot of great solutions, and there's a lot of great work happening. So it's kind of a double answer.
Yeah. I would add to that too, that every year people commit more and more funding. The government, private agencies, private individuals, more and more and more as we talk about this and do events like this and remind people that you can have thoughts of suicide and then go on to live a happy life. The more that we educate people on like the hope and the healing that is tied to some of these, the better the outcomes are. Like this CNC program through the state, it's this amazing thing. And Colorado was chosen because yes, it has a high suicide rate and it has communities that are working together. Like that is why they chose Colorado and Larimer County to receive all of this funding, is because they know that we can change the direction of that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Kim. And like funding really has a big piece of it, and especially in Larimer County, with the new formation of the behavioral health services and the facility that's happening, and all the community dollars that are being invested in nonprofits and mental health. And it's like the exhibit at the Museum of Discovery. All those things are creating a lot of momentum for us to have discussions around mental health. And so there's a lot of influx of local funding that's coming on. And I think nationally, we've seen a big increase in funding as well, but it still has a long way to go nationally. So I'm sure, Kim, you can fact check me on this, but the stats that I usually say is, breast cancer in this country kills about the same amount of people that die by suicide. So it's in the upper 40,000s. And every year, this country spends $2.4 billion on breast cancer research, as it should. I think that's extremely important. I'm advocating that we should spend that much on breast cancer research for sure. Conversely, we spent about $60 million on research around suicide prevention. So I just think it kind of puts, and it kills about the same amount of people. So it kind of puts that problem in kind of perspective, where I think we should be investing billions of dollars in research for anything that takes a lot of lives in our community.
It's a big difference. I'm curious, I'm curious if you have a theory or if you know on why we are not dedicating the same amount of funding. Like what is the block there for folks?
I can give my short answer and then let Kimberly go for somebody else.
It's probably the same.
Yeah. I mean, suicide's a tough subject. You know, it's heavy. Mental health is stigmatized greatly. And I think a big reason why suicide is so prevalent and it's a problem is that there's a lot of shame wrapped up in it. I mean, for so long, just how we've talked about suicide, I'm surprised we haven't brought this up before, but oftentimes you'll hear the term someone committed suicide. We are not in favor of using that terminology because if you think about other things that people commit, like what are they? Sins, crimes, right? So it's kind of stigmatizing even the language of how we've talked about suicide. So I think there's so much shame and stigma around it that it's almost scary and inappropriate to kind of broach the subject. And I think that's one reason why we kind of have a higher rate of suicide, not just in Colorado, but in the whole country in general. So I think just the shame and stigma is a big piece of why it doesn't receive as much funding. It's because some people are afraid to have that conversation. And I think just even at the policy level, I think for a long time, folks were afraid to engage in conversations around suicide or mental health. That is changing, but I think that's a big piece to do with it is the stigma. But I'd be curious to hear what Kimberly says.
I was going to say exactly the same words as you. No, I mean, but really that, I think that is the biggest component is that it's just not something we talked about. You know, back in the 80s, we didn't talk about cancers openly. We didn't talk about HIV and AIDS openly. We didn't have those conversations. And it wasn't until like we were talking about suicide sort of, but not really until like the early to mid 90s. And it takes time for that to catch on. And even saying the word suicide, like putting it in a presentation and saying, come and learn about suicide makes people nervous, right? When we're doing our trainings, it makes people uncomfortable because it's life and death. A lot of people have had those thoughts in their life and have never been told that it's okay to talk about them. I would bet that Scott has a very similar experience as me, where when people hear the job that I do, their first thought is, oh my gosh, how do you do that? And then it's, oh, can I tell you about a friend? Or can I tell you about my personal experience? Because all of a sudden we are this person who's not afraid to have these conversations, who's talking about it openly and giving people permission to also have those conversations. And it's not until everybody is having those conversations that we're going to start to see the money follow that. But we have to change cultural perceptions around mental health and help seeking behaviors, and that it's okay to not be okay. We have to see that shift to see the funding shift as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, and I'll do the plug again, I think one way that we all can reduce stigma around mental health in general, and especially around suicide, is just by changing our language. Because really how we talk about something or someone has a huge impact on that thing or on that person. Our words have power, right? And our words and our language is also collective. So it's kind of built up and there's almost a domino effect. So we're really big on not using the term committed suicide. We recommend instead saying someone died by suicide, someone killed themselves, someone took their own life. There's all sorts of other ways to say it that don't have the stigma wrapped up into it. Because if we talk about it and use the term committed suicide, there's a lot of shame around that. So people that have lost a loved one to suicide are going to probably feel worse when they hear that term thrown out. And then maybe someone who's considering suicide might feel a little more shame about how they're feeling as well. And it might increase the likelihood of them trying to take their own lives. So I think how we talk about it really has a big impact. And then just around mental health in general, how we talk about mental illness has a huge impact. So I'm a big advocate of using person-first language. So someone's not bipolar, they're not a schizophrenic, they're a person living with schizophrenia, or they're a person living with bipolar. And you can use it with other examples too. So they're not a homeless person necessarily, they're someone who's experiencing homelessness, right? Because people aren't their diagnoses. You don't call that person melanoma, right? You know? They're not, So I think it's just really important that people aren't their diagnoses. And also, if we talk about them being a person first and they're not their diagnoses, that puts a little bit of room for hope and recovery in there too, because diagnoses don't have to last for forever. and it's not all of a person's life. So I'm just big on changing the way that we talk about something. I think it can really have a big impact.
Yeah. Well, and I also think, to tag on to that, when we're talking about language, people in general don't hesitate to say something like, I have a broken leg. You know what I mean? And when we start to talk about mental health the same way we talk about physical health, it takes the stigma away, it takes the power away, it takes the heaviness of it away. And so we're always encouraging people so this is why we say died by suicide. So instead of somebody committed or they completed, or I've heard a successful suicide, it's when we're talking about physical health, we talk about it with compassion and care. We don't say somebody successfully completed their cancer and died. That's really offensive. You would never say that about somebody. And so we're not saying there wasn't a successful suicide. They didn't complete suicide. They died from suicide. Somebody dies from cancer, they die from suicide. And so when we shift our language to bring in the same compassion and care that we use with physical health, we can also reduce the stigma with mental health.
That is so interesting and true. And I really am so intrigued by this conversation about language, because it is really true. And I think about too how when we don't talk about it, right? People aren't sure what language to use, and then there almost becomes a stigma around using the right term versus the wrong term, and then people just don't talk about it because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. But when we can have these open conversations, then we can learn from each other and learn the right terminology and feel more comfortable using it. And that's such a big part of the whole mental health conversation, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I would encourage folks just to go ahead and start having the conversation.
Yeah.
Don't be too worried about saying the wrong thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm in the field and I still sometimes, drop committed suicide out there, and that's okay. I just catch myself. Or if I'm having a conversation with someone else and they say that, I just use that as an opportunity to gently educate them about why we don't use those words, then have a broader conversation around stigma in general. So it turns into a nice learning opportunity. So we don't have to shame someone or shame ourselves if we make a mistake, because mistakes are learning opportunities.
Yeah. The important thing is that people are just talking about it. How you talk about it, just talk about it. Talk about it the same way we talk about, our headache. If everybody was like, man, I'm not having a good day today. I'm a little anxious today. I'm feeling a little depressed today. The same way we said, oh man, my head hurts, or oh, my stomach's not feeling great today. Like, it just talk about it. The more we talk about it, the less stigma there is around it.
I love that, Kimberly. And I have noticed in my social circle during this time that the farther we have gotten into the pandemic, the more comfortable I've noticed people are with answering that question of, how are you feeling today? I think for so long we felt obligated to say, oh, I'm fine. I'm good. Feeling good. Everything's fine. But it does seem like maybe we've reached a tipping point there where it's starting to become more common for me to hear, I'm feeling anxious today. I'm not feeling great today. This is a tough one. And so I'm curious, and so much of that seems to be from the pandemic and from just this position we're all in, to maybe spend a little more time with ourselves and realizing that we're all having these shared experiences. And we have an audience question here about the pandemic as well. So I'm gonna kind of jump into that. But how has the pandemic affected your work in suicide prevention? And I would add to that, what are you seeing during this time that is, I'm sure you're seeing a lot of challenging things, but is there any surprises that you've had during this time? And maybe happy surprises?
I'll say a happy surprise. I might take Scott's thunder. I think a happy surprise is that people are coming together. I mean, I know things are very difficult all around right now. In Colorado, we had the fires. We're right in the middle of an election. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Like, things are hard. And at least in my personal experience, in my community, in my circle, in my, bubble, of the world, I've seen people coming together, and I've seen people trying harder and more resources and more outreach and more like, how can we help each other? And so I feel like that is a happy surprise. And also people talking about their mental health openly, right? Just like here, laying it out there and saying, here's where it is. And I think that's beautiful, because I think just that modeling behavior of here's how I'm doing gives other people permission to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But we definitely have seen other trends as it relates to COVID. But I'll let Scott talk about suicide prevention in Larimer County and what those efforts have looked like here.
Yeah, it's such a great question, and we knew this was definitely going to be a question along the lines of COVID, of course, which makes so much sense. So I guess suicide prevention, particularly in Larimer County, and for us, I mean, definitely we were hit with all sorts of challenges to begin with, because most of what we do as an agency, we're really out there in the community providing education opportunities, whether that's for youth in middle schools and high schools, or if that's for any community groups or faith groups or businesses. So obviously when things were shut down, we could no longer be in person. And it was really challenging with schools. But, there's a lot of tools and ways to be creative around there. So we were able to pretty quickly move everything to be offered virtually. So we can offer all of our education programs over Zoom. We're in most schools still with whatever platform the schools choose to use, if that's Microsoft Teams or Google Connect or, whatever, all the different things and acronyms out there. But I think one interesting thing that kind of both of you touched on actually is, I think it really highlighted the need for connection and the ability and the importance of people to be vulnerable about how they're doing. I think we all quickly have learned that social media or Facebook or Zoom or conference calls, they're great communication tools, but they're not good connection tools. So I think everyone's kind of feeling this lack of connection. So what I'm noticing in my kind of personal circles as well, Sierra, like you mentioned, I'm noticing people spending a little bit more time and being a little bit more intentional when they check in. And the question of, hey, how you doing? It's more genuine than it used to be. Like, how's it going? How you doing? And then like, you good? Like moving on, it used to be like, you good? All right. You good? Great. But now I think it really is showing a genuine concern, and people are being open and much more vulnerable. And I love that. And I think it's, kind of spilling over into work areas too. I know most of the meetings that I have for work now over Zoom, everyone kind of starts them with like a check-in of like, how are you really doing? Like rate your feelings. Like, I really want to know how you're doing. So I think I've just known that as a broader trend, but just as far as the general prevention work goes, just switching over to offer things virtually has been a challenge, but we're doing that. One kind of silver lining about that, we offer grief support groups, just like they do over in Weld, called Heartbeat. I know Kimberly was instrumental in getting a bunch of those going in Weld County, creating curriculum for them. And we were offering some over here in Larimer. And, we kind of have sparse attendance, 2 or 3 people one night, maybe 4 people the next night, maybe 1 person. And we weren't seeing that great of attendance pre-COVID. Then once COVID happened, we moved all those support groups to virtual. And we found all these other people from around the county, from more rural areas, say like in Red Feather or Estes, that no way were they going to drive down to Loveland or Fort Collins for an hour-and-a-half support group, right? But if they can just join on Zoom via their computer, it's much easier. And it was really removing a barrier, getting some of those services. So that's one plus, that's one silver lining we've seen, is it's a lot more accessible for folks. Now, it doesn't mean that technology and internet is not accessible to all. And I do want to point that out, that there's still a large percentage of the population all over the world, all over the country, all over Colorado, and in Larimer County too, that don't have access to technology, don't have the financial resources to get a computer. So it's definitely not widely accessible, but I think it's more accessible to folks in geographic locations.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out, Scott. I think that's really important. One of the other things that Scott and I talked about as suicide and suicide prevention, and what does that look like as it relates to COVID? And I think it's a question that we get quite often, which is, has the pandemic increased suicide rates? And quite frankly, we don't know that. We don't have that information. It's too soon to know that information, to say it definitively one way or another. But what we do know is that we have seen a huge increase in people accessing care, accessing hotlines, accessing services, accessing that. And that is really encouraging. Whether it is that they all of a sudden needed them, or that they had the time now to access them, or that whatever it is, what we have seen is this increase in people accessing services. And so that has been a really important trend that we've been paying attention to and being mindful of. How do we accommodate those things, especially when not everybody has easy access to technology. And so that's been a really important thing for us to pay attention to.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll tag on to that, Kimberly. I think, oftentimes people will say, or like ask me, like, well, I hear there's so many more people calling the crisis line. Like, isn't that indicative that more people are dying by suicide? And it's not. It's actually the opposite. So I view every person that has the resources or was informed about the phone number, or had a friend reach out to them because they're worried and gave them the phone number. So every person that accesses crisis services or calls that line, to me, represents a life saved. So the more people that are accessing resources, the better. So I think there's a lot of lives being saved at this time. So the numbers of people accessing those services locally and at the state and nationally are actually really high. And the real problem, I think, in suicide prevention, and then it's around mental health in general, is there's quite a bit of resources. The problem is making resources accessible and making sure that people know what they are and that they can access them. And right now, I think it's indicative that there's a lot of people being able to access those resources. And like Kim said too, it's I've read a lot of things locally, some letters to the editor, and heard things nationally too about this suicide rates going through the roof during COVID. And like Kimberly said, it's really inaccurate, dangerous, I would even say, and just unreliable to take a snapshot of like, oh, during these 6 months, this is how many suicides happened. Compare that to last year, the year before. So it's not an accurate depiction of suicide trends. And so I think it's a little bit risky, and it also switches the narrative to making it seem like there's a problem without any solutions. And if the narrative is flipped that way, someone who's considering suicide might be more likely to attempt because they're even more hopeless. There's not a solution. And even though I said it's dangerous to look at those time periods and compare suicide rates, we haven't seen an increase in suicides at all. So I won't give specific numbers, but there has not been an increase since COVID. There has been an increase in people accessing services. There has been an increase in people talking about struggling with mental health. But on the flip side, what a great thing that people are now talking about that. What a great thing that people are comfortable to ask for help. What a great thing that people know what resources are out there and are able to ask for help.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to talk about shared experiences and feeling like a community, going through a pandemic together, that'll do it for you. No, that's really great to hear, and I'm so glad that we're seeing that increase in use of services. And I think too that just checking in with each other and just those connections, that though we're physically having to stay away from each other, but I think that's really highlighted for folks the importance of our relationships and our human connections, and so that's really a wonderful thing to see during this time. We've got another audience question that kind of goes back to our conversation about language. But do you have any suggestions for a replacement for the word attempt?
Yeah, I get that question quite a bit, and everything that I have learned, and Scott, please, if you have something different, is that there's not actually anything super harmful about using that word. That it is what is happening, and that it's appropriate to use that language. Would you agree with that, Scott?
Yeah.
I felt nervous saying that all of a sudden, but again, everything that I've learned or read or heard has not taught me to do anything other than that.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. There's always, you've done enough things like this, Kimberly, where there's like 40 or 50 questions total that like cycle through over the time. You'll get the same ones. There's always a couple, but I'm like, I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. And this is one of those few where I haven't either heard of a different word besides attempt. I do agree that can be kind of a loaded, heavy word, but I think that's just a sign that the topic is kind of loaded and heavy, and there's a lot behind there. So I wonder if that's like our own like felt sense behind the word, or if that power lives within the word. I'm always like questioning if language informs culture, if culture informs language. And I think it's more of kind of a dance back and forth. But
I think, one of the trends, to like go really far back in the conversation, that we have also seen, which is beautiful, is the lived experience trend of having more and more people sharing their stories of suicide attempts, suicide thoughts, suicide things. And so if there is somebody who watches this and says, this is what has been meaningful to me, and this is how we changed our language, please, please, please share that with myself, share that with Scott. Like we're not here to say everything and this is the way it is. Like if there is somebody out there with lived experience who has gone through this and it uses different language, we're always open to that conversation and would love to hear more from them.
I think one little piece to tack on is a term that I know Kimberly and I are both passionate about this, but I'm referring to people that have had a suicide attempt as suicide attempt survivors. Lost someone, is they're a survivor of suicide loss, because it just highlights that, they had struggles and those struggles were difficult, and it puts some acknowledgement to that those things are real and heavy, and they're not permanent, and it's not discounting that there's recovery in them. So I think surviving is a nice empowering terminology that we can add to the suicide attempts. But I totally agree with Kimberly also. If there's anyone with lived experience that has better terminology, I'm sure there is out there. I'd be really curious to hear it. Tough question.
Good question. It's an important one. I like it. Yeah. Teach me.
Yeah, thank you both. Well, we are down to our last 6 minutes here. I know time really flies, but this has been such an amazing and incredible conversation. And thank you both for being on tonight and being so open and so willing to have this conversation. And I hope it's the first of many for our community. As we're wrapping up, we've talked a lot about big picture stuff tonight, but suicide can be really incredibly personal. And I think for many people, there's always this question of what can I do? What can I do for my loved ones? What can I do for my community? And so I would love it if we could chat about that. What can individuals do to help prevent suicide for their loved ones, for their community? And maybe Scott, this goes back to what you were talking about before, but I think sometimes people feel like once someone's mind is made up, that's it. There's nothing we can do, and I'm guessing that's not true. So,
yeah, I would start out by saying, first off, if there's somebody who is experiencing thoughts of suicide, who's watching this or knows somebody who's experiencing it, one of the best things that we can do is help people get connected to care. That first step is so hard and so scary. And there is a lot of stigma wrapped around suicide still and thoughts of suicide. And so asking somebody the question, knowing where to go for help. We have a 24-hour crisis center. We have 12 of them in the state of Colorado. Like, they are available. They're there for people. They're there at no cost to the community. They can go there and get support 24/7. In Larimer County, that's through Summit Stone, and Weld County, that's through North Range, or just Colorado Crisis Services will get people connected. I think one of the best things, if somebody is like in the throes of it, is to get them connected to care, and to be a good listener and remind ourselves that it's not your job to fix the solution. It's not the therapist's job to fix the solution. It's our job to support people through that. And one of the best ways we can do that is by listening and then connecting people to care. So I would just start out with that and then maybe lob it over to Scott to wrap us up.
I love it. No, that was such a great answer. And I mean, it's so ironic. So like, I'm a social worker by trade, and Kimberly's a mental health professional, and we got into this work, no doubt, to help people and improve the mental health of communities. But to be honest, I think the average everyday citizen can have a much bigger impact on suicide and saving people's lives than a clinician or a professional can. I think, kind of like the CPR analogy that we talked about earlier, really noticing warning signs, it's going to be much more obvious, and many more opportunities are going to be had by people's loved ones, by people's neighbors, by people's friends. To be honest, even a stranger on a walk crossing along the river trail. I would say those opportunities are much more prevalent than someone sitting down with a mental health professional. And just being brave enough to ask the question of your neighbor, a friend, or a stranger, hey, couldn't help but notice you seem a little down lately. How are you doing? And just being open to having those conversations like that, and then being willing to listen, like Kimberly said, I think that's the biggest role that we can have. And we're not asking people to be therapists, just like we're not asking folks who are CPR certified to be a doctor. We're just asking them to temporarily make sure this person's safe right in that moment, contact the professionals, and make sure the professionals get connected to that individual in crisis. So they don't have to perform any therapy, they don't have to do anything like that. They just have to call the crisis line, offer to call the crisis line with that person, and get them connected to resources. I think one of the most important things that we all can do, though, is just being willing to check in. It's also really important that we're direct with our language when we're checking in. So it's completely appropriate and completely okay to ask someone if they're thinking about killing themselves, or ask someone to think about if they're thinking about suicide. I think that's the real way that we get to that information. And I've asked that question hundreds of times, and I've never once had someone who felt like they had to be dishonest about it. They were always answered honestly. And then if they do say yes, like, validate that. I'm so glad that you let me know. And I think we should connect to some resources. Do you mind if we call the crisis line together? So I think that's just one way about going about it.
I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, I think it's so important, and it's totally okay. And there's no, like Scott said, no research anywhere in the world that suggests that you're going to put the idea in somebody else's head. It's always appropriate to ask a question if you're worried about somebody.
Yeah, so I would just encourage everyone, like, the best thing that we can do is be more connected with each other, reach out, ask someone how they're doing. If you're at all concerned or if you're at all worried, you probably have that worry for a reason. And just don't be afraid to check in with someone and ask how they're doing and get them connected to resources.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. I think that is a wonderful place for us to wrap up our conversation. Thank you for joining us. This has been really great. I know that I have learned so much and really enjoyed getting to chat with both of you tonight. And I hope you have a great rest of your week and get out there and enjoy the sunshine before the cold weather blows in.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks. It was a real honor. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you to all of you for joining us tonight and getting to listen in to Scott and Kimberly. We are doing this program every 2 weeks. So please check the museum's website, FCMoD.org, to see our full list of upcoming programs related to mental health, and to find more information about the Mental Health Mind Matters exhibit now on display at Fort Collins Museum of Discovery. I hope that you join us next time. Thank you.